Hello, how are you doing? How have you been?
I'm doing okay, Romana. I've been in, we've been all locked inside, but I'm doing okay.
Okay, good to hear. Um, your organization, SOS Malta, have partnered in Volpower project for the last 2 years and a half almost. Can you explain a little bit of context about how does SOS Malta fit into this consortium of Volpower organizations? Is it on the academia side or on the NGO side, or is it a research institution? What kind of organization is SOS Malta?
So SOS Malta is a multifaceted institution. We have anything from research, we have social aid, education, but our heart lies with volunteering. Now, the way we got stuck into Volpower and the way we were partners with everyone in Volpower was we were meant to provide educational training for the volunteers. And we're also meant to participate as all the partner countries as in the research side as well. We had prepared a lot for the training as well for the volunteers. And in general, SOS tends to work with volunteers, which compared with Volpower, our volunteers tend to be older and of a different generation, a different type. So this was quite an exciting thing to get into a different type and a different area of volunteering.
Alex, what was your part in Volpower Malta? Because you didn't have a big team, so maybe you can explain what were different subjects or segments of the project that you were working on.
So in Volpower Malta, till last month, I was the only person employed on this project. And that meant I worked on PI stuff, research, logistics, taking care of the volunteers, social media when there needed to be done, promotion, meetings, traveling. It just, I got the full Volpower experience.
What does the PI stuff mean? Because we are like, the interview is for the, yeah.
So the PI, the principal investigator's role was to coordinate the project in the country and of course sign off on or write the documents and the reports that the country was managing, the work packages, and send them over. Again, in Malta, this happened to be the same person, being me. I did have some help from the CEO and the finance, of course, which is also doubles as the organization secretary in Malta, Claudia and Grazella, but mostly it was output of work was coming from my side and trying to keep up with all of the projects.
Malta and Slovenia are, when it comes to dimensions and populations, are very different countries to the rest of the consortium countries. Can you give a little bit of context why Malta is so special? Because it's quite from the different perspective that is very different. Maybe if you can explain a little bit about Malta and especially from the perspective of migration and population.
So Malta is in a really interesting position because it is a tiny country. We have 650,000 people that live here. Population bloats up to 800,000 or to 1 million during tourist season, or with third country nationals and Europeans that come to work here. But still, that is usually the population of a small city or a large town in continental Europe. And what makes it special is that we are on latitude with Tunisia and just north of Libya, which is one of the main routes of migration for irregular migration in Europe. The other two routes being, of course, Greece and being, of course, Spain. And being in Malta, we also are very close to Italy, very close to Sicily. In fact, it's only 110 kilometers away, I believe, from Malta. And there are a lot of migrants that unfortunately do not succeed to make the they travel to Europe through our waters, but there are also some that do. And those that do end up landing in Malta with the sole intent of moving on. If they do land in Malta, they oftentimes do not want to stay here. And so we end up with a very changing migration scene where we do not really have a very big permanent population, although there are some that are settling now, and there are some people who are trying their best to become part of society. They tend to move on. The third country national population that is developing in Malta right now is, on the other hand, from India and Pakistan, and from the far east, basically, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, etc. They're coming to Malta for opportunities of work through government initiatives. So it's quite interesting, where we've developed a culture in Malta which is sadly very xenophobic. We do not want outsiders, but it's sort of okay if they come on our terms, and we're bringing in these people from abroad in these specific locations. Sadly, when these people come to Malta to work, they are paid the minimum wage. And then, tying in with the topic of Volpower, which is volunteering, they do not often have the energy after working 2 jobs to volunteer or to participate in society. Apart from the fact, of course, there is, as I just mentioned, a very strong xenophobic, quote unquote, patriot movement. So we end up with not really having a population that is part of Malta, but it's living here, if that makes any sense. It is so crazy to think there are parts of Malta where people live, but they are treated as almost animals, because they treat it as if they don't exist. They're meant to come out, do their job, and go back to their little hole. And that does not really sprout a culture of integration and societal cohesion, which results in a lot of stress and a lot of discussion and debate on what to do, on how to improve the situation, oftentimes leading to these people wanting to go away after 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And very few families that settle, however, tend to do very well and tend to integrate incredibly well with society. And that's where volunteers mostly lie. But then again, these people would be in their 30s and 40s generationally. So the youth seem to be quite a question on this case, because the youth, if they're in Malta, they're often Malta for a fleeting moment. I'm not sure if I tackled the question properly. I just went on a tangent there.
I think it's okay. What about, do you have, how many do you have, like the second generation migrants? Is there the population that is also relevant, or is it?
Unfortunately, I do not know the numbers, but it is becoming relevant. It's becoming relevant in terms of seeing different phases. Usually, when I growing up, Malta was a very homogeneous and very standard one bar. You see very similar features, very similar everything. Now there is heterogeneity, meaning that there are a lot of different faces and a lot of different cultures intermingling. You see it in the shops that are opening, in supermarkets, in corner shops, in the food that is being cooked in restaurants. Before, we used to have pizza, pasta, burgers, steak, and British food. And now we have anything from the, what you would call the, the sushi, Chinese craze that happened in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. And now we're getting Pakistani food, Afghan food, Libyan food, Tunisian food. And it is amazing to learn the culture of these people, because these are people that actually are settling in Malta. They miss their home food and they start selling it as a way of making it, ends meet. And it's delicious to eat. And the best part for me is to sit into these restaurants, hopefully COVID ends soon so I can do it again, and listening to these people's stories, listening how they're settling in Malta, but still have family back where their home is, but they call Malta their home. And it's nice seeing that transition. It feels almost as if Malta is in that transitional period before there would be proper first and second generation. There are a few, but they are not from the migration crisis per se. They're from people who traveled way earlier.
It sounds a lot like Slovenia, but in Slovenia, and I would like to hear the comparison. In Slovenia, mostly the capital city has so much choice when it comes to food, which of course reflects also the newcomers. But the rest of the city, it's like more of the changes are not that obvious. How is it in Malta? Is it the thing that basically is more relevant on the coast, in the capital, or is it would you say the whole island changed and all microcosmoses of this small country already changed and are not so monolith anymore?
So I would say the whole island is changing, but this is because of how small we are. We are 220 square kilometers. That is tiny. Like if I start walking now in one direction, the closest the sea is on one side is 30 minutes. The other side, I'm literally talking about crossing the island completely, is less than 2 hours. If I walk from tip to tip, it will take me a day, like 12, maybe 16 hours if I take it really slow. So it's really small. So anything that happens on one side, it's happening on the other side. People are dispersing everywhere. And since we're also very heavily populated, it's, it's very difficult to just have one particular area impacted more than others. Yes, there are still village centers which are very quote unquote traditional and very quote unquote Maltese. And I say quote unquote Maltese because Maltese people in general are just a mishmash of people. Historically, Malta has been a trade port and a trade island. And when you consider the Mediterranean from a historical perspective, everyone used to come and settle here to trade. And it shows in our history, it shows in our culture. And now we're getting the new generation of integration of new cultures and new histories. And on a scale which we were never exposed to before, which of course has scared some people.
I asked the question earlier about second generation volunteers because if I remember correctly, the volunteers that we met in Zagreb, they were like second generation, but I might be wrong, second generation migrants. So can you share a little bit about the volunteers, because you worked with volunteers throughout these 2 years with different sets of volunteers with different backgrounds. Some were basically living in Malta, born in Malta, some migrated to Malta for certain periods of time, and many had to leave because of COVID. So if you can just describe maybe if from the perspective of their backgrounds, who were they and what were they doing and how were they contributing towards the society and community?
So we had a number of volunteers, and as you said, they were coming and going, and this also translates from what we discussed earlier, the transitionality of Malta, where people come and leave and come back and leave. It's like you cannot really get rid of it, but you cannot really stay. We had volunteers which were Maltese, and they themselves had a European descendancy. They had British and French, descendancy in their family history. But then it was interesting to see we had Germans and who were migrants from Poland, who were migrants from Russia. So their family keeps migrating. It was really interesting from that perspective. We also had two who were not Syrian directly, but as you said, second generation. So their family, either their parents or one of their parents or one of their grandparents was Syrian, and they have been living in Malta, but they still identify as with their Syrian culture and heritage, and they still identify with that. And they have, in fact, tried to go and help out as volunteers. One of them did during the start of the unfortunate civil war in Syria. And it's quite interesting to see their perspective. It's quite interesting to see how they still relate to a country which they, technically speaking, never lived in, but they still feel super strongly about it. And then we also had a couple of Americans who were here temporarily on a project on, I believe it was the Fulbright project. So the Fulbright project, essentially America sends out students across the world in partner countries, and they do projects there. They do volunteering projects. The American government supports them financially, and their job, their mission objective is to leave an impact. And one of them, which is the volunteer that worked with us the most, has done an incredible job where she took the opportunity of not just doing what she was set out to do, which was teach at schools. That was part of the project, but she went ahead and opened her own classes for English and started teaching the migrants which were speaking, the ostracized migrants which were trying to make enough money, trying to make do in a society that honestly ignores them, and gave them an opportunity to learn English, to share their feelings, to learn the culture. Because that's another thing which I didn't understand and kind of stuck with me. There is such a culture shock for these people. There is such an issue of them not understanding. And it's so different. They come from such a different background. And we tend to lump Africa and Malta as one place. It's not. Everyone has their story. And for us Maltese, I mean, I can say from personal experience, distance is an issue to understand. When I first left Malta, properly when I was 18, when I was like properly conscious of the world, it took me so long to understand the distance between Malta and the US, because that was my first long distance trip on my own. And taking that into perspective, I could sort of understand when people tell me, oh, I come from there. It's like, yeah, that's really far away. Most Maltese never left Malta. A lot of Maltese don't even leave Malta. People my generation started traveling a lot. My parents, them traveling for them just to Italy is a big deal. It is a colossal deal. So then when you take that, and for them to understand the mentality of a migrant coming in to live in Malta, going through all that insanity, because most of them have traumatic stories to tell, and they just want a bit of their home with them, and then you get, no, we don't want that here. So you isolate this group of migrants. It's just insane. And this is what the volunteer did. She noticed this issue because she could understand the distance, because she's traveled, she's American, she traveled a lot in the world. She understood that these people want to talk. So she found a medium which was teaching them English, but she didn't really teach them English by saying the ABCs. She taught them English by listening to their stories, by giving them opportunity to talk to each other. I really liked before COVID hit, we had a series of events planned. And the first one was, we put them in a room with trainers, public speaking trainers, who gave them public speaking experiences, how to stand in front of a room and talk. That was the first step. Then after that, we had planned, they were going to go in schools and talk about their story. Something they never taught. And I didn't hear it from them directly, but the volunteer reported to me and told me, this is what happened, right? And it was very emotional. And even she was emotional. She was telling me how some of them cried because they were able to talk. It's almost as if some of them had PTSD. And that, for me, is incredible. That is the essence of Volpower in Malta, in a sense. That little small event did so much for a few people, which is just incredible.
How were they perceived because they went to school, right? So were the stories heard? Was there empathy on the other side? Did you get any feedback? How was the response in the classroom?
Sadly, the school never happened because COVID literally hit 2 weeks later.
So this part, when you say that they were able to talk, they were
they were talking to themselves in a room, and there were a few other people. There were some Europeans as well trying to learn English, and there was a small community. So they were talking to the community first before going to the school, but just the community was enough to help them understand that they're not alone.
Yeah, this is it's very powerful, like telling stories, sharing stories, yeah, and having someone on the other side who listens.
Yeah. In fact, the volunteer, she told me one of her techniques that she was taught, because she also got training for this, was to use music. So they had some sessions where they just listened to songs, wrote down the songs, and then they themselves were able to understand, oh, the song is a story. So they were able to, you know, do karaoke nights, etc. Again, the issue with this was sadly that like we couldn't explore it further, was the timing of COVID was horrible. And I found out that the volunteer who had to leave Malta because of COVID still managed to keep in contact with them, which is amazing. And they still sort of talking through Zoom and through WhatsApp. So there is still a community that was built.
When it comes to language and integration, it's always it's so important. Can you explain why the language is the door to social inclusion and integration, and how your volunteer use this as a door to listen to them, but also to help them integrate into the society and also equip them for their further journey?
Because if you're allowed to talk to others and understand others, we actually were having this conversation earlier today. It's when you speak a language, there are different levels. You can just speak a language, you can understand what is said word by word, or you can speak a language and understand what is being said between the words. You understand the feelings, you understand the emotion. And for us Maltese, that is really important. Without many Maltese noticing, Maltese language itself is Italian, English, written on Arabic basis. So we are a Semitic language, we are a Romance language, and we have Anglo-Saxon. And we can speak these three languages. I can understand what an Arab speaks in Arabic because I know Maltese. I can understand an Italian because I know Maltese. Now, I am lucky because I grew up learning that. I learned English at a very basic level. I learned Italian, and I can understand French to a certain extent if they don't speak too fast. But someone speaking Swahili in Malta, and Swahili, last time I checked, has dozens of different dialects, which are completely different from each other. Coming to Malta, not understanding a single word and being shouted at in English, they're going to hear just anger. They're not going to hear the person trying to listen. We're panicking. There's a lot of stuff happening. There's someone dying, whatever. They're not going to understand that. And that creates animosity. And then when you learn the language, there is that animosity still stuck there. But when you learn how to speak the language, it's different than learning just the language.
So you also had another member of volunteers who did an amazing job when it comes to using sports as a tool of social inclusion. Can you describe a little bit how sports can play an important role in social inclusion and in community life from the perspective of the volunteers that you worked with?
So the volunteer in question stopped working with us at the time, however, kept on, and it was nice to notice we kept a little bit in contact. They went on and tried to, Malta is like most Mediterranean countries, they love football. They love playing soccer, for those Americans out there. And he tried to bridge that gap by finding a community of Syrians or descendant from Syrian refugees or Syrian migrants. And he tried to organize a football club based on that. It's just people meeting together, playing football. And it did do waves, and the social media did do waves on national media as well, on newspapers. And it does help because when you're playing a game, if everyone follows the rules, there is that sense of competition, but also it levels the playing field, if it makes any sense. Because you're competing for something very similar, such as playing football, trying to kick the ball into the goalpost. It creates that sense of camaraderie, and after the game, people are friendlier.
Alex, is there a highlight that you would pinpoint when it comes to the interviews? When you did the interviews with the volunteers, was there something that was surprising or new, or something that you would find valuable?
What's not surprising but valuable, and a story I will remember for my life. One of the volunteers told me the story, the same volunteer that did the schools, the teaching the migrants. She also noticed that female migrants weren't joining her classes, that they were just not attending, while she'll have something like 16 guys being there. Again, these men would be anything from 18 to 40s. Most of them are much older, and she got confused because she knew the women were there. So she took it upon herself. She made friends with a couple of them, and they end up having chats between them, just women, from women to women. And the stories that the women had to share, the struggles they had to share. She told me this particular story, where she was speaking with one of the women, and this woman just told her life story. And from what I understood, without going into much detail, after they had the talk, this migrant looked like a new person. And again, going back to the fact that talking is amazing, it's therapeutic, and we don't do it enough in general in our lives.
That's beautiful. Thank you. So Volpower was working with volunteers, but it was also working with on the level of research. We were basically diving into several topics, and one of the things that we looked into was the research for Volpower country reports. And about this report, Maltese, there was like your country, and you looked into Maltese migration context. And is there something that you would like to add for this report specifically that you didn't already explain earlier when you were giving us a bit of Maltese context?
The one big thing which I didn't really mention is the issue with the Maltese government authorities not really doing what they can to help the situation. Rather than helping the situation, they are actively ignoring it, which is making it worse. We're ending up with, when I mentioned the patriots, they call themselves patriots, but they are neo-Nazis, and we'll call them for what they are, growing in Malta, and their sentiments and their teachings, and now it's spreading like wildfire because they're apparently giving lectures in Italy on neo-fascism. The government ignores it because there is this current mentality in Maltese politics: votes first, questions later. So get the votes, don't care about what happens. And migrants don't have a vote, so their voice is drowned out. Residents in Malta don't automatically get a vote. And you have situations where Identity Malta, which is the government administration that helps people get their papers sorted, is understaffed on purpose, underfunded, and not equipped to deal with the situation. They have few people dealing with hundreds and hundreds of both locals and internationals who are trying to get this done. And then on top of that, they have to deal also with migrants trying to get their residence permits, trying to get their either qualified as refugees or protected migrants or protected status or other. And that situation, that stress that is added by lack of foresight, let's call it that, by the government giving them the benefit of the doubt, is bad. And it causes, unfortunately, an environment which shouldn't be happening. It's almost as if, again, if it's not lack of foresight and it's active, this is criminal almost.
It's not difficult to find this kind of attitudes in Europe in general. In European Union is quite a common approach.
Yeah, Malta is one of the few countries that still has detention on arrival, which is illegal. But they pay a fine every year rather than fixing the problem. They pay a fine which is more money than if they invested the money to sort out the problem, which is not having enough capacity to deal with the arrivals.
It doesn't sound as a solution, but it does sound aligned to the general zeitgeist of EU, that's for sure. I think there are not many countries that deal effectively with this challenge within this time, yeah. So there was another segment to this output that we worked on, and there was a survey that each country did. Can you maybe explain in a few words what was the goal of this survey and what was the results that, if there were some, that you could describe?
So the survey in Malta didn't do that well. We got 100-something people who started it and only 62 people who finished the survey. Out of those 62 people, I think 11 were actually third country nationals. The rest all came from a very specific branch of society who did not live, they basically lived in suburbs or outlier towns from the main regions. They were anything between 25 and 45. There were, of course, outliers, but that was the average, the curve, and they were mostly women compared to men. There were men, but mostly women, and they came from highly educated backgrounds, most of them having university degrees or even more. And that, for me, shows the problem, which also was highlighted by me earlier in the country report, which is that migrants are not given the facility to participate. But not just them, there's also a bracket of Maltese society which is struggling, and it is unable to even consider volunteering as an activity. And that bracket, having that is dangerous, because putting it in the most politically correct way possible is you can have someone scapegoating the migrants who should come below them. And that showed from our survey. Again, we do not have any definitive proof. We do not have strong science because it was such a small sample. But this came even though thousands and thousands saw the post on Facebook. We boosted it on Facebook. We emailed over 1,000 NGOs in Malta, and we contacted as many people as we could individually. Still, not many showed interest in filling the form, which shows the interest in volunteering is different in Malta than anything.
So how is volunteering perceived on the national level? How would you say? Is it like, because when it comes to European Union, there are many programs running that are basically promoting volunteering. And also, if I understand, SOS Malta is doing a lot when it comes to promoting volunteering and coordinating volunteering activities. So how would you say how is volunteering perceived in Malta? Where is already what is the general perception, and what do you think should be the direction to which the things should change to catch up maybe the rest of the countries?
So volunteering in Malta is mostly focused in older people or with religious organizations. So you volunteer, I forgot the third part, which would be almost a religious organization, at this point political parties, because they venerate the leaders of political parties as much as a religious figure. We have a situation where we have a big amount of volunteers. SOS Malta is a smallish NGO. We have employees-wise, I think we're just around 10, plus or minus some interns. And then we have a few projects that hire subcontractors, which is not big. It's very on the small side. But we have over 150 volunteers in one of our projects, which works with hospital. They are volunteers who are retirees. They go to hospital and they keep company to people who are in sick wards. They just do the rounds. We used to give them tea and a biscuit, but unfortunately biscuits and sugar were X'd out of hospital. So they just go around and give a cup of tea and talk with people and giving them company. It's therapeutic for the volunteers themselves, because these are usually people who don't have a lot of free time on their hands and don't know what to do. And it also helps, of course, the people at hospital. We also have volunteering situations at university, where we worked with medical professionals, future medical professionals, to provide a number of things. These volunteers, and it ranged from anything providing care to, again, the team of medicine and hospital, and providing care to old people's homes, or to even just support local nurseries or doctor centers by medical students who would be in their second, third, or fourth year at university. They would need some extra hours. They would do it as a volunteering because they need it, not because they want to give something, but they need it. And there is this mentality: you do volunteering because you were going to take something from it. Then the other volunteering would be religious, where people go around collecting money for village feasts. We have these events that happen once a year where they do a weekend of fireworks, festivities, and it's very Mediterranean celebration of religious deities, but basically, you know, Roman Catholic, there's God, and then there are a million saints, and everyone's competing which saint is best. So they volunteer to, you know, support their saint. It's a community event. It brings a lot of people together, and it's fantastic in that sense. It's beautiful to see the firework displays, the lights, the banners they make. It's amazing. And then there is, as I was saying, the political, and the political is volunteering with your political party because you want your political party to win. You're asked to spend countless hours doing whatever. But unfortunately, and we just mentioned it, the European discourse recently has turned against volunteering and NGOs. And in Malta, NGOs are being blamed for migrants arriving to Malta. If you work for an NGO, you're making millions, smuggling people. And this is blatantly told. I was told this to my face by government officials. Sorry, what? But yes, that is the perception of volunteering on a national scale. And it's to a point where even laws are being passed where it limits funding for NGOs and how NGOs can collect money through donations, to the point that government needs to know every single cent made through donation was made by who, how, when, and you need a legal permission from the government, even though it was done in a quasi-illegal manner, how this law was implemented.
This is another common trait, how NGOs are being criminalized, and how basically solidarity towards non-EU nationals is being criminalized. Does all that you learned through Volpower, did you get some new insights, some new knowledge, or did your work on Volpower in any way contribute towards your future projects that you are?
Yes, of course it is. And I think the biggest, not shock per se, because again, I knew it was there, but it was so different seeing each country. Their situations are so drastically different from what I thought they would be, and from what Malta's is. And looking at Glasgow, Austria, Netherlands, and Italy specifically, their migrant situation is so different. Such different problems, such different issues to be tackled. And when I saw that, and then again I compared it to Malta, I hope that one day will be in the position they are, facing the problems they're facing now, because they're nicer problems than the ones that are sadly being faced in Malta. I mean, a few days ago we remembered the death of one of our, we call it Remember Our Brother. A man was shot by two armed soldiers, Maltese soldiers, shot him and killed him. And one of them admitted because he couldn't find a cat to shoot. So for me, hopefully one day we'll have less problems.
Is there a personal takeaway from you? Would you say maybe would you point out to some most very valuable experience, gained knowledge, insight? Is there something that even, of course, the situation in Malta is beyond challenging, and it's definitely very difficult to see where the whole European Union situation is rotating towards. But at the end of the day, we are persons, and would you say that you are, as a person, are taking away something for yourself, or did Volpower maybe open some, I don't know, maybe any new horizon, also on the personal level?
It taught me the world is bigger than I thought it was, and that is a constant issue of scale that I mentioned earlier. It's an issue of scale for me. Scaling Malta in Malta is very different compared with other countries. So it taught me that even though the problems in Malta are big, but on the bigger scale, they can be solved, even though if they seem impossible to be. It's, you know, seeing, as I just mentioned, the other countries and how people in other countries interact and act, it just gives me hope.
That's a nice thought to wrap up the interview. Thank you, Alex, very much.
Thank you very much, Romana.